Hey, everybody. Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Hey, I am continuing on my path of showcasing my own work in depth this December. So, this week's episode is going to be all about my passion, my love, my baby, what we call defense documentaries. These are short, true films used in criminal cases, sentencing, and post conviction relief to humanize our clients and better tell their stories. So much more powerful than words and all the other stuff we lawyers present to try to get justice at sentencing. So I'm not just a lawyer. I am actually also an award-winning documentary filmmaker. I made my first defense documentary in about 2005, and I've been leading the charge in this powerful form of legal advocacy ever since. So again, rather than having me talk at you for an hour, I decided to share with you an episode of another amazing podcast I was a guest on called The Business of Story. This is created by Park Howell, a business and marketing guru who fundamentally understands that story is the one true path to persuasion, no matter what the arena. So Park is also part of the Narrative Gym family, having co-authored the business version of the book. I did the law version, as you know. Long and short, this guy knows story and he knows marketing like nobody's business. In a sense, lawyers are salespeople, so it's a natural fit. He gets it. So I encourage anyone who's interested, visit his website, www.businessofstory.com, and check out what Park does, and also check out the podcast. And now, please enjoy this rebroadcast. I think the business people would call this cross-marketing of the Business of Story podcast, episode 182, How Defense Attorneys Use Cinematic Storytelling to Reduce Sentences. Wow, Park, episode 182, and you're already up to like 389. You are my podcasting inspiration. So, FYI, Park, when he recorded this, it was only on audio. So if you're on the YouTubes, take one last look here because you'll not be seeing my face again today. I think you'll be okay. On with the show. Enjoy it.
I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
In 2004, Daniel was arrested for forging federal checks and thrown in jail. He hadn't seen his mother in a while, 2 years to be exact, and he called her to let her know that he was still alive and he was in jail. Mom lived out of state. She decided she was going to come visit him. And Daniel describes that day. He said he walked into the visiting room in a line with all the other inmates, and they sat down and they waited for the visitors to enter, and they too entered in a line. And as he watched, he scanned the faces, and he finally saw the face of his mother. And he locked eyes with his mom, and his mom locked eyes with him for a moment. And then she turned her head away, and Daniel's heart sunk. He knew that his mother was so ashamed of him and what he had become that she couldn't even look him in the eye. And his heart sunk, and he kept watching his mom. And what he noticed about his mom is his mom was starting to look at other of the inmates in the visiting room. It started to lock eyes with them and turn away. And what Daniel figured out was his mom didn't look away because she was ashamed of him. She looked away because she didn't recognize him. His mother didn't recognize her own son. That's how far he had fallen. And the reason is he was addicted. He was addicted to methamphetamine. And for the last 2 years, he'd been living on the streets, in motels, and shooting intravenous drugs. And he had been on drugs more years of his young life than off drugs. And he was completely lost. And of course, that's why he committed this crime, because he needs money for drugs. And so that was his story when he came to me. And that story was so compelling. But what was more compelling was what happened next. And that is, while the case was pending, the judge gave him an opportunity to be released pre-trial before he was found guilty or convicted and sent to a drug rehabilitation facility. And he didn't just get through the rehab program, he became the star of the program. And he excelled like we rarely ever see someone excel in a program. He graduated from the program. He was put in charge of watching the facility when the other people were away. He was a mentor to other young addicts. He was speaking engagements. He had got a trade. He got a job. He met a girl. He was being a dad to her child. Everything. I mean, it was a rehabilitation of epic proportions. And so when I got his booking photo, when I saw the old Daniel versus what he was now, I said, this is a story that has to be shown. The truth of this story is in Daniel's redemption, what he has done to make amends for the things that he has done, and more importantly, to demonstrate to the court that he's never going to do it again. And all you had to do was look at the before and the after picture. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes a picture is way more powerful in a courtroom than anything a lawyer can do with their own words or their own papers, their own pleadings. And so we made a movie. We did a before and an after, and we told Daniel's story, and he ended up getting probation. And that was like 2005. We're in 2019. He hasn't been in trouble. He's living a great life. He's got kids. It's one of my favorite success stories. But that was the first sentencing video that I ever did in my practice as a younger lawyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Business of Story. And Doug Passon, welcome. Today we are exploring a really interesting, fascinating intersection of using story in the courtroom to help, criminals, people that have pleaded guilty to a crime, get a lighter sentencing. In some cases, a lighter sentencing. And there's a lot of controversy in some areas and some camps that go along with this. Then ask the question, when does story and storytelling and narrative and cinematic techniques of using documentaries in the courtroom become manipulative? Or does it ever become manipulative? Or what are you ultimately trying to do with these films?
So, story it permeates every aspect of what lawyers do, period. And I'm not talking criminal lawyers, civil lawyers, transactional lawyers. If you are a lawyer, you need to know story, period. It doesn't matter what form, what context. So we can start there, that this idea of bringing story into a legal case should not be controversial in any way, shape, or form. The idea of not bringing story into a legal case should be controversial, because in my mind, that's borderline malpractice. Story is how we persuade. Story is how we persuade. That's in this from every
in the branding marketing world. Absolutely.
That's exactly it.
So you started this, a bit of a trend here back in 2005. This was your very first defense documentary, for lack of a better term. Give us a little bit of your background, because you didn't start as a cinematic storyteller in the courtroom. You started as a public defender, I believe.
Yes. But going back earlier than that, sort of origin story, all of my life is from as early age as I can remember. There were only two things I ever saw myself being in life. And one was a lawyer and one was a filmmaker.
Why? Do you have moments in your life that said, Doug, I'm going to be a lawyer.
Well, people, I always like to argue, and I was always in trouble as a little kid. And my parents and people say, well, you should really be a lawyer because you can argue your way out of it. So I think I grew up with this sort of thing, like you're just a born arguer, and you have this sort of anti-authority streak running through you. You like a good fight. And, I had some relatives in the law, and so it was not completely alien to me. And filmmaking is a thing that I was always drawn to, I think, because I just love movies so much. Some of my earliest memories are going to the movies with my dad, and, it was James Bond. It was Rocky. He took me to the Rocky movies when I was a kid, and it was like you go into this dark, cool room and you're completely transported to another place in time. And if the story's good, you're in for a ride, you're immersed. And there was something about that just lifted my soul. And so I started when I made my first movie when I was in high school for sociology class. And it was like, this is before digital editing. This is the 80s. So I had two big honking VCRs that I would connect together to do the editing. So I've always been into that. But when I was getting towards the end of college, I had to decide law school or film school. And, law school seemed to be the more practical
You
course.
might make a little bit more money as an attorney than as a filmmaker.
Right. So I went to law school. I was always interested in being a public defender. I was a criminal justice major in undergrad at Indiana, and it just was something that I was passionate about, and I knew that I could really feel, good about doing that kind of work.
Like a social justice warrior a little bit?
You might say that.
Yeah,
you might say that, So I went to law school, and in law school in 1995, I had an internship at the Federal Defenders in St. Louis, and I worked for an amazing lawyer, and she had a case. And it was a criminal case, and it was a federal drug case. And there was a mandatory minimum sentence. The guy was looking at like 10 years. And, we can have a debate about whether that's fair or not. I don't believe in mandatory minimums, and I don't believe in these draconian drug sentences. But the long and short of it is that he was married to a woman who was dying from lupus, and she relied on him for every aspect of her daily care. Food, bathing, shopping, you name it. And this woman was brilliant, and she had the idea that we need to show the judge what his life is really like and how much his wife depends on him. We need to make the judge think long and hard about what happens if he's taken out of the equation to the wife. What's going to happen to her? And who's really the one going to be punished in this situation? And so we took again, this is still before digital editing, so big old honking video camera, and she followed him around, caring so beautifully and delicately for his wife, and submitted this like 45-minute unedited VHS tape to the judge, and this guy got probation.
And what year was this?
This is like 1995 or 96, because I graduated law school in 96. And I think that's the moment I figured out that even though I chose law school, I was going to get to do both.
You saw the intersection right there, because here's a 45-minute videotape, unedited, so it's about as primal and basal a story documentary as you could make, and yet you saw the impact it had on the judge.
Yeah. Because, judges have heard things like this and stories like this, and they hear them over and over and over again. But when you can actually see it, it's that idea of being transported to another place in time. Ideally, we'd invite the judge to the house and say, just spend the day with us. But that's not how our system works. Video is the next best thing to portraying the truth, the literal truth of this situation. And it's also a very redemptive, we always forget in this process that these are human beings. Yes, they've done something wrong. They've broken the law. They've made mistakes. But in so many ways, we like to use that to keep a distance from them. Like I would never be in that situation, or I can't relate to them, or they're the other.
They must just be bad people.
Right. And when you can show them their full life and the full truth of their character, you realize that you have a lot in common with them. You start to see yourself in the other. And when you see yourself in the other through story, you root for people more. you want to put your arms around them and say they're like me in a lot of ways. And once you start to see yourself in the other, then you start to ask the question, what would I want if it were me in that situation, or my own son or daughter? And then it makes it harder to just kind of throw them away and put them in prison.
So what happened in that 10-year period from when you first saw this happening in 1995, the impact of that long video, to your first real production, in Daniel's story? What was your maturation as a storyteller in the legal profession?
Yeah, I think I just spent several years trying to figure out how to be a good lawyer before I really got so comfortable in my own skin that I started thinking about making movies for cases. It really was not done that I had seen, other than this one example from 10 years earlier. I mean, I think people were doing it like that a little bit here and there, but making actual movie style documentaries for cases, I hadn't seen that before. And I think for a while, if you don't see it, it's out of sight, out of mind. And so it was a little bit of a leap to say, I want to try this. I think this is an important tool of advocacy that we should be using. Because I was still doing my own fun movie stuff on the side and taking screenwriting class and nurturing that part of it. But it was, this will just be my hobby kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what snapped. I think it was just the right case came along at the right time and I was off to the races.
And so in your studies as a screenwriter, you were studying Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and that sort of thing. And how did you bring those story structure principles to bear on your work?
Yeah. So it's really kind of easy when you get into it, because what people think, oh, if you're studying screenwriting, then you're writing fiction. But that's not what story is about. Stories, even the fictional ones, they're designed to tell us truths about life. And so what you're focusing on is, what is this story really about? And those are where the story points start laying themselves out. And it's very easy to look at a real life situation and say, what is this story really about? And what it's really about for me is taking back the story from the other side. Because the way our system works in the criminal system is, from the moment the person commits the crime, the government has total control over what the story is being told. The first version of the story is the police report. So the police write it from their perspective. Do you think they're going to include every helpful fact about what maybe happened in the case? No, they have an idea. They're going to write a story about it. It's hopefully a true story.
Well, and a lot of it's subjective too. It's
Exactly.
what they thought they saw or experienced. So there's nothing to say that it's true, but it is the only account written down at that point. So They are crafting, in some cases, fiction, or facts, in the gray area of fiction, because us human beings are not perfect. And recalling, especially big events or what am I trying to say? Extreme events in our lives, of which police are in the middle of all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So they write their story, they bring it to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor writes their story. It's called a charging document. It's an indictment. It's whatever the charges are that say what happened, right? And that's how the case kicks off. And, it just goes from there. And so the question is, when does the defense get to tell their story? And a lot of defense lawyers, I think, make a rookie mistake, or a common mistake, which is just take their story and see if you can poke holes in it and say, this is not accurate or this is not accurate. And just see if you can poke enough holes in it to create doubt, then maybe you're going to get by.
But now you're trying to overcome their quote unquote facts with other facts, and it's just opinion against opinion. And everybody knows, hopefully, listens to this show, that the only thing that beats a story is a better story.
Exactly. And that's all litigation is. It's it's a battle of two stories, and the truest one wins. It's that simple. So people who think this is controversial, I think they're operating from a misconception of that lawyer stereotype, that we're liars. Liar, liar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? Some lawyers are. There are good lawyers and there are bad lawyers, but the liars don't win in litigation usually, because people are, by and large, logical people. They have instinctive, especially judges who've seen it all and done it all, and they know if a lawyer's credible or not credible. And so when I tell these stories, first of all, as a lawyer, believe it or not, we have an ethical duty to tell the truth. We don't get to lie. Second of all, if I tell a story that feels wrong, that feels not true, that feels, wild or hyperbolic, drama, it won't work. It won't work. It's just like when you go see a bad movie, you don't want any part of it. It's like trying to feed a child the vegetables when they don't want to eat. They're going to purse up their lips and turn away. You can't force feed someone a bad story. So,
when I first learned about you and your work here about 6 weeks ago, a buddy of mine, Dan O'Boyle, who's a copywriter, sent me a link to an article in The Atlantic. And the headline of this article is "New, quote, disturbing reality, unquote, in criminal court." And they talk about this short documentary that was shot about your work in a film festival of all things. That's pretty darn interesting. Were you the creator of the film festival?
Yes,
okay,
yes,
we'll talk about that in a
Yep.
second. But in this article, I read it, I watched the documentary, which I enjoyed greatly. And I got to tell you, Doug, my first reaction when he sent it to me was kind of, ooh, are they somehow giving storytelling a bad name, or lawyers doing this? Until I dug deeper and really learned your story. And, I was so happy to hear you were based here in Phoenix. So I'm sitting here out at the law office. Yeah. And I like the tagline of your law office here too, which is law like you've never seen.
Yeah.
So you are using, as a visual advocate for people, you are telling their stories. But in all this, I think a lot of people share this same thing. Wait a minute, he's getting criminals off. Wait a minute, this person is bad. They deserve to do, the time. You do the crime, you do the time. Is he being manipulative? Is he really telling the truth in this? Is he just playing on our emotions? And then it comes down to this one thought here too, and then I'll turn it over to you to defend yourself.
Okay.
Make the judge suffer. That is the whole goal of this. So let's unpack that a little bit. How in the world did you find yourself in the New York Times and the Atlantic first talking about storytelling to, help defenders in their sentencing period?
So there was some controversy over the "make the judge suffer" comment, and that didn't go over so well. But what people don't know from watching that video is that it's a verbatim quote from a judge. It's a federal district judge, Judge Kane, and he wrote an article some years ago to defense lawyers. And he said, I won't get too far into the weeds in the legal aspect, but the backstory is there was these sentencing guidelines that were in effect that were virtually mandatory for a judge. So the judge had very little discretion. They had to basically plug in these numbers on a chart, on a grid. And where those numbers popped out, there was a range of sentence, 0 to 6 months, 10 years to 20 years, whatever it is. And the judge basically had to stay in that range no matter what.
So it totally dehumanized the process.
Exactly. And in 2005, the Supreme Court said, no, that's wrong. That's not constitutional. Judges must have more discretion to deviate from those guidelines in the appropriate circumstances. And so the judge wrote an article that said after that, it used to be easy for the case. It was like paint by numbers. And after that, our job as defense lawyers was to make judges agonize over every single sentencing decision, because these are human beings and they deserve individual consideration. You needed to make judges suffer every single time over their decision, to make sure that judges do what's right. And I practice in front of a lot of judges, and they want to do what's right. They just don't always know, because our job as lawyers is to tell them, is to make our case and give them all the information that they need to make the right decision, which in their heart of hearts is what they want to do. So that is where the making judges suffer came from. Now I take it one step further, because I know, especially in public defender, when you're dealing with people with, who are in poverty, who maybe have substance abuse, mental health, maybe they've been abused, abandoned, foster care. These are people who have suffered their entire life, majorly, sometimes more than we can ever imagine. And 9 times out of 10, it's that suffering is connected directly to why they did what they did. And in order for the judge to understand who they are, how they got where they are, they have to understand their life's journey. And that's a painful one. And you sometimes need the judge to feel their pain. They need to suffer right alongside with the client in order to truly understand, again, to make the right decision in the case. And it's not about feeling sorry for the client. It's not about making excuses for the client. It's about helping them understand how they got to this moment in life, and then let the judge decide whether that is worthy of some sort of consideration.
And I think you make a good point in some of the articles I've read of yours about not getting a judge to sympathize, but to empathize.
Yeah.
Would you define for us the difference between sympathy and empathy?
Yeah. Well, I'll plagiarize from McKee. I don't know.
Robert McKee. He's been on our show twice.
Oh, you're kidding.
No,
okay.
I'm not kidding.
So I'm going to have to go back in your back.
I'll tell you right now, show number 7.
I'm writing it down.
And show number 34. He liked it so much, he even reached back out and said, Park, can I be back on your show? I had to beg him for number 7. Number 34, he came out.
Well, I've taken his story seminar, his famous, 3-day course.
I did that too.
Oh, nice.
Back in 2010, I think it was.
Okay, wow.
I was wondering if we were sitting in the same room by chance.
I don't know, but I was sitting 2 seats down from Drew Barrymore, so that was pretty cool.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Drew. Sorry. So McKee really sums it up. He says that difference is fundamental in storytelling. And he says your character does not need to be sympathetic, but it must be empathetic. And he says sympathy is more like likability, and empathy is more like me.
Mm-hmm.
There is something about this person that I can relate to even on a subconscious level. And again, it's about creating those connections, almost deeper level connections to where you see yourself in the other. They're like me. So he describes sympathy as like a Brad Pitt or a Julia Roberts, somebody who we'd love to have over for dinner or go out on a date with, which is not your normal definition of sympathy. Usually when we think of sympathy, we think about, I feel really sorry for you. But that works here too, because in my experience, we don't connect through sympathy. In fact, sympathy builds a wall between us. We may feel sorry for like a homeless person on the street, and we may give them $1, but we don't relate to them we don't see ourselves in that situation. Normally we ascribe ill sort of motives like, why can't they get a job? Or if I were in that situation, I'd just be working. I wouldn't be back. You're putting at arm's length. This person is so different from me, and I may throw you $1, and I'm probably not even going to feel good about doing it, but I feel like you just, kind of guilted me into it. There's no connection. And there's no likability in that situation either. So sympathy for me works both ways.
Yeah.
But empathy is all about bringing you in closer and seeing yourself in the other.
And the way I think of that too is sympathy is I like them, and empathy is they're like me. Is from that standpoint.
Beautiful. Exactly.
Connect them.
Exactly.
The Robert McKee thing, as you follow the hero's journey, and he's not a big believer in that. He says it is a structure, but he teaches, of course, lots of different structures. But in the hero's journey, as you teach, one thing that Campbell says is when you follow your bliss, doors will open where there are only walls before. And as I started following my bliss in storytelling, and much like you have in the law profession, I've done it in the branding marketing world. I got invited out to Robert McKee's home in Connecticut, and I spent a morning with him doing a podcast, my very first podcast I'd ever done. This
Oh,
very
wow.
same Zoom recorder I bought for that. I'd never done this before. Business of Story wasn't even a thing. And I spent 2.5 hours in his living room interviewing him
Very
about
nice.
story structure, had lunch with him afterwards,
jealous.
and away I went. It blew my mind. And when I left there, I thought, oh my God, I am like Campbell Manifest in following this passion and curiosity around story
Yep.
and the crazy doors that it opens. But in your case, you saw it, but you were changing the lives of people. I mean, you were opening new doors to people that could be thrown away for years because we see the human side of it,
Yeah.
of them. Would you tell us the story you were sharing with me a little bit earlier about the contractor? And what I'm particularly interested in, folks, and I want you to wait for it, is the judge's response and reaction to
Yeah,
this.
because we don't always know if these things are effective. Even if we get a better sentence, the judge doesn't always say it's because of the video. But this gentleman was in the military and serving his country in Afghanistan and through combat, and was a decorated veteran, more medals than you've ever seen. And he ended up going into private contracting still in Afghanistan, and was indicted for some taking some bribes, and charged with very, very serious crimes. And so his lawyers hired me to come into the case and help craft the sentencing story and make a sentencing video, and we did. And the video was the full picture, the full truth of who this person was. Yes, he made a mistake. Yes, he's owned up to it by pleading guilty. Now the question for you, Your Honor, is what's a fair sentence? What's the punishment? And by the way, punishment is not just measured in years or months in prison. When you're convicted of a felony, punishment comes in so many forms, even if you never set foot in a day in jail. You may have your freedom restricted on probation. You're a convicted felon. You can't vote. You can't carry a firearm. You can't serve on a jury. You can't get a job, in a lot of situations, or at least not the kind of job that you want when you're a convicted felon. So there's many forms of punishment, but we were talking about prison here. How long is necessary to achieve all those goals of sentencing? And we told the story of his life before the offense, his life during the time, the turmoil he was in, the time he committed the offense, and all the good things he had done after the offense. And the unavoidable, inescapable conclusion is this was a momentary deviation from an otherwise exemplary life. His true north, his sort of moral compass, if you will, was blown off course. He was lost, and he made some horrible decisions that'll haunt him for the rest of his life. Now, why was he so lost? That's an easy answer. You just have to look at what he experienced in war and what he went through and the crazy situation he was in a foreign country when these crimes were occurring. And then there was a lot of story about everything that he had done afterwards to make amends. And so the video went to court, and the judge at sentencing said, I was prepared to send you to prison. I'm paraphrasing here, but she said, I came prepared to sentence you to prison, but after watching the video, I found myself thinking about how I would explain to my own mother why it is that you deserve to go to prison. And I came to the conclusion that I would never be able to explain it, so I'm not doing it. And she sentenced him to a probation and a year of house arrest instead.
So you made that judge suffer through your storytelling, your aim. And in suffering means that they had to really come to terms in their own emotional with their own emotions about, gosh, this is a human being. And there are other circumstances that have led to this activity. And we all have shadow archetypes. There's, we have the good and the bad in us. We like to keep those at bay. But sometimes stresses in our life and what we've been through, they can materialize.
Yep. And his was really a classic hero's journey in a lot of ways. And by the way, I just got to say, because there are still some lawyers who hear this and say, oh, this would never work in my case. My judge would never go for this. Not true. We're hearing from judges all over that when this is done right, they really do appreciate this form of advocacy. First of all, they get so much paper. You walk into a judge's chamber, you're just going to see stacks and stacks of paper. So I think they appreciate that they could just watch a movie for 10 or 15 minutes and get all that information that they need that way. But there's a wonderful lawyer that a colleague of mine named Alan Ellis, and he publishes these articles called in Law 360 called Views from the Bench, and he goes around all over the country and he interviews judges about sentencing advocacy, and he always asks them about sentencing videos, and almost always the judges say, yes, please, let's do that. It's just a matter of doing it doing it well.
Yeah. So what do you say then, Doug, to those that will say, you're just using storytelling to be manipulative, that these people deserve it, and how dare you?
Well, any lawyer has the power to be manipulative. And traditionally, we've told stories, good ones have told stories on paper. We tell stories with our own words. We bring witnesses into court to tell stories. So this idea that this is somehow, that manipulation is a new idea in the legal system doesn't carry a lot of weight with me. The question is this some sort of extraordinary tool of manipulation? And I argue, I guess maybe if done in the wrong hands or in the wrong way, that someone could try to use it in that way. But I don't think it works to be overly sentimental, overly, with dramatic, crying witnesses, just all this melodrama and manipulation. That's not, never works, because the audience will tune out immediately. Judges especially have a stink detector. They know when they're being played. They're smart people. They don't get to the bench by accident. And so if it doesn't, first of all, again, I have an obligation to tell the truth. You don't get to lie. But if it doesn't feel good, if it doesn't feel true, if it feels overtly manipulative, judges will tune it out, and they'll throw it on the scrap heap, just like a pleading that's poorly written.
And that's a disservice to your client.
It's a disservice. It's a disservice to your client. Now, what I think people who really worry about this is because it's really, really effective. And if you do it right, your judge is going to feel something because you've gotten to the emotional truth of the story. And what's wrong with that? If it were you standing before a judge for sentencing, or your child standing in front of a judge for sentencing, wouldn't you want the judge to feel something when they're making a decision about their whole fate and future?
So it's not manipulation. It is sharing the emotional truth. And my argument in your case, defending the use of story in the courtroom, is stories actually amplify the truth. They put a microscope on you that when you tell them really well, and some people put the BS monitor up, go, wait a minute, that can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
Well, then it has to be true, because they can go, it's so easy to go do the digging now and figure out if you're telling the truth or not.
Right.
That you can't afford to do anything but shine the light on truth in your storytelling.
Yeah. And seeing is believing. That's why I love the movies, because you're showing something to the judge. Even if it's just showing a person speaking, you get to view their body language, their sincerity, how they're dressed, how they look, and the judge can assess their credibility in that way. And in the case of Daniel, I mentioned those two images. So I could talk about rehab, I could show a certificate, but even if I didn't do a movie in that case, I would have two images. And I don't do movies in every case. We do them in the most special cases, the ones that are most well suited for it. And I can talk to you about that. But even if I'm not doing a movie, I will try to put pictures, even in my written pleadings, as much as I can, because pictures tell the truth. So in Daniel's case, it would have been his booking photo where he looks like a skeleton because he's been on methamphetamine for years. And then after rehab, his full face with a glow and a smile. And that tells you everything you need to know about his journey. The work that he put into his own rehabilitation is what I call the quintessential redemption story. Those are my favorite stories.
It would seem like almost all of them are redemption stories.
Well, you would hope for that. But there's only 3 stories we ever tell at sentencing, believe it or not. And I call them the 3 R's. One are reasons, one are reduced or relative culpability, and the other is redemption. And sometimes you have more than one, which is great. But reasons are that explanation. Yeah, we did it, and we're sorry, but I need you to understand why this happened. And maybe there's an explanation, not an excuse, an explanation that will help. So, it's like the guy who steals a loaf of bread to feed his family, or the guy that steals a candy bar because he felt like a snack. There's a difference. It's the exact same crime, but you need to understand the difference.
What about that gentleman you wrote about from Iraq?
Yeah.
That to me seems like a reason story.
Absolutely. This was way back, but this was back when we were still at war with Iraq, and he had come here. Well, this is such a hot topic because he came here for asylum. Mm-hmm. So he crossed the border illegally and surrendered to the authorities and went through the lawful process of claiming asylum.
And why was he looking for asylum? I mean, was he really needing it?
Oh, my goodness. So he was actually from Iran, and he was a Christian, which in Iran at the time was a very dangerous thing to be. Iran is run by the mullahs, and it's an Islamic society, and they were literally chopping up pastors in Iran and leaving them on doorsteps. I mean, that's the truth. We had the newspaper articles and the human rights. This is the truth.
What year is this?
It's a good question because the case itself we did probably in 2006, but I don't remember how far before that he came here. But he went through the lawful process, which it's a whole nother podcast, but people think everybody who's coming here crossing the border illegally is a criminal. No. If you surrender to the lawful authorities and go through the lawful process, you're not in trouble for crossing illegally. That's our law, and that's our country, right? We're a place of safe haven for refugees who deserve it and need it. So that's what he did. He went through the lawful process, became a permanent resident, went through, got out, and was a master tailor. So I love when my clients have these great special skills that we don't have. Yeah, made suits, high-end suits. And he brought his children over, and he was a single dad, and his children were the most incredible, intelligent. One was 11-year-old classically trained pianist, and they were just the most lovely.
And he did all of this lawfully. So he got in.
Oh, yeah. All of it lawfully.
He sought asylum, got it, and then brought his kids in.
Yep. And then he had other family back in Iran who were suffering in the same way. And in his mind, he said, okay, all I got to do is get them across the border any way we can, and then they can do what I did and go through the lawful process. And so he was negotiating with a guy to smuggle these folks across the border. Well, the guy was an informant.
So get them into Mexico and then smuggle them
across
into the
U.S. border.
And then say, we're here illegally.
To authorities, yeah.
And we're looking for asylum. Okay.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then there's a court process in place to test the veracity of their claims. They don't just get to say it. I know there's this misconception that everyone's just making up some story about how bad life is back there. But the truth is things are really bad in some of those countries. And it's life or death. And again, see yourself in the other, because if you were in that situation, you'd be swimming across the Rio Grande to whatever it took to protect your family and provide for your family. But again, probably a whole nother podcast.
Empathy versus sympathy.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I got off track. But anyway, so he thought, get them across and then let them go through the same legal process and I'll save them. They're my family. So he was negotiating with this guy who was an informant, and the informant told the police, here's this Iranian who's trying to smuggle Iranians across the border in the dead of night. And we were in the heat of the Iraq war, and we were looking at Iran, and we had all this fear of terrorism. So they made this out to be something it wasn't. It's not a terrorist trying to bring other sneak terrorists into the country.
But they own the story now.
Yeah, they own the story. And it got some press. So they have defined who this case is. And we said, we need the judge to understand that, yeah, he was negotiating with this guy, and he was trying to get these guys here, but that wasn't who he is. He's not a terrorist. He's a Christian. He's not an alien smuggler. He's a master tailor. He's a father, to his children. Like, he's just like you and me. And so we made that movie, and the judge was very, very, very persuaded, and he got probation. And
did all of his family ultimately get in?
That's a good question. I'm not sure of the answer there. I'm not sure.
But they painted him out as a terrorist, smuggling coyote. I mean, yeah. So you can see how that story, that narrative got painted on him, and you guys had to come back in and say, no, here's the truth.
That's the true story.
Here's the emotional truth of the story.
Yep. And I remember in that case, even the prosecutor loved the video, and he had kind words to say about it. So he had softened up, which is another important takeaway that we've learned throughout the years is this isn't just for the judge at sentencing. You use story to persuade at every stage of the proceeding. So, you can make the movie early on and give it to the prosecutor who has all this power in deciding whether to make a plea offer, what the plea offer should be, how much time they should offer. So you can persuade them first before you even get to the judge. Yeah.
So that's a great example of a reason story. You have three of them, reduced and redemption. What's a reduced one? What does that look like?
Yeah. So a reduced culpability might be, it could take a couple forms. One is, yes, I did something, but I didn't do as much as the government says I did. So yes, I'm guilty, and yes, I'm owning that, but I need you to know that it's not as bad as they say. So let's see, for example, a drug conspiracy. We love to charge conspiracies. So those are agreements between individuals to engage in drug trafficking. So you may have the guy at the top who's manufacturing all the drugs and making gajillions of dollars and murdering people to enforce their drug cartel, and, goes down the chain. Well, the person on the low end of the chain will get charged in a conspiracy with all these other people. So you need to say, okay, yeah, I did. Maybe I drove a load of drugs across the border, and I've got to go be punished for that. But I don't know this guy. I don't have anything to do with him. Maybe they're being held accountable for the acts of others, things like that. The other thing is, maybe there's let me see, what else would that come into play? Usually you're comparing your culpability to others who have either done this, who have been involved in this case, or done the same thing in other cases.
Yeah. But that's a case too where I would imagine you have more gray area in this, like, I'm guilty, but I'm not that guilty.
Yeah.
And somehow that's probably got to be a little bit harder story to tell, I would think.
Yeah. It's just
not so black and white.
It's not. And it's my least favorite because it's the least compelling of them. But in our system, it's a necessary story to tell. And
then you shared the redemption stories.
Redemptions are the best. And by the way, redemption can come in before or after. So I use that in two ways. One is, what have they done after they've done wrong to redeem themselves, to fix the problem, pay back the money, whatever, go through rehab, all those great, I love those. But you also focus on the redeeming qualities of the person too. And so, what my colleague Alan Ellis likes to say is these are things that people do when no one's keeping score, right? Because that tells us the truth of who they really are as a human being. So yeah, they made a mistake, but let's look at all these incredible, amazing things they've done in their life to show us the full picture of the human being. So that's the other spin on the redeeming qualities.
And what I've read in some of your articles is you really have three primary elements that you're looking for to make up a story.
Mhm.
I shouldn't say make up a story, to write, to create and craft that story. And that, again, not all sentencings really are open to story. It doesn't work in every single case. But could you quickly take us through those three primary elements that you look for?
Sure. And so I just to tweak what you said, I think every single sentencing is open to story. Every case is open to story. The question is it open to a movie?
Okay.
So, because movies, we say that if you want extraordinary results, sometimes you have to take extraordinary measures. So the movies are somewhat of an extraordinary measure. We don't do them in every case.
Mm-hmm.
We save them for the cases that are best suited for this. And because when they're done too often or badly, I think it could poison the well and ruin it for the rest of us, right? So there are three things that I look for in a case. One is a good story, which that's your podcast. You know what those elements are, and your listeners do too by now, hopefully. And then you need connective characters. And people always get so uptight when I use the word characters. Whenever I bring story terminology into the law, they think, "Oh, you're making it up. It's fiction." Don't get upset. Don't get excited when I say characters. I'm talking about people. I'm talking about human beings. But there are the people that need to tell the story. Who's going to tell the story? Because sometimes your client can, sometimes they can't for whatever reason. But you need people to narrate the story. I don't do like outside third-party narration and things like that because I think that's contrived and doesn't connect you in the same way. So you need those connective characters. And when I say connective, again, it helps to have people that you can relate to that are telling the story and narrate. And then you need pictures because movies, as Sid Field would tell you in his great book Screenplay, movies are primarily stories told with pictures. So if you're going to make a movie, it better be visually compelling. And if you're just putting like people on a couch and doing interviews and stringing them together and it's just a parade of talking heads, that's boring. And you're never going to see a documentary that's just that. You're going to see those great historical family photos or, crime scene footage or, anything you can put in there to visually move that story forward and create those connections. You're doing well. So I always ask, am I going to be able to have all three of those things? And if any one of them is missing, you probably have to save it for another case.
And that's why the law offices of Doug Passon, it is law like you've never seen.
Yeah.
Now, are you practicing law as much as you are now helping lawyers with their storytelling? Or how has this impacted your practice?
So we'll file that under Campbell's Follow Your Bliss because I was for let's see here. For almost 20 years, I was practicing law, and most of those years were as a public defender, and that's hard work. And my hat's off to people who can do that for their whole careers. But when I started making movies, what I was figuring out is the pure practice of law was sucking me dry, and making the movies to help my clients was filling me up and lifting my spirit. And it was a way to sort of blend my creative passions with my passion for justice. So I've said to myself, I got to figure out how I can do more of that and less of the other. And that's when I went out 4 years ago and created my own law firm video production studio. It's both. You're sitting in it right now.
We are. Yeah.
And I think it's the only one of its kind in the whole world. And that was my bliss. Like I just said, there's got to be a way to do this and make it work. And thank goodness it's happening. So most of the work that I do right now, I'd say like probably 85% of my caseload is story for lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you started this film festival, the Sentencing and Post-Conviction Film Festival, which is probably the best name for a film festival I've ever heard.
I don't know about that. The origin story of that was basically once I started doing this for myself in the early 2000s, then I started teaching other lawyers primarily in the federal defender system because I was a federal public defender at the time. So I would go all over the country and teach other lawyers how to do this in their own cases. And there are a lot of lawyers doing this now, especially in the federal defenders, and they're doing a great job, and I'm proud of them. But what I quickly figured out is that people were getting sick of hearing me talk and say the same thing over and over again. And I'm like, there's got to be a more compelling way, than just me talking about it. So we decided, okay, so people are doing these now. Let's see it. And so send us your work, and we'll pick out the best examples, and we'll use those as teaching tools so we can show other people's work and talk about what we love about it, what we don't. And then we came up with these awards and that we would give to the lawyers. And primarily it was just a way to teach, but it was also a way to have some fun with the lawyers because they have a hard job. So this became a thing at a national training, at a defender training conference.
Now, how many of these video documentaries do you think you do a year?
It varies, but boy, that's a good question. I'd say on average 20 or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And each one runs between 5 and 15 minutes. Is there a secret to how long you want these to run?
Movies, it's short as possible to get the message across. I think movies are too long these days. I don't know why these movies are 2 and 3 hours. Get in and get out.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest sin of a filmmaker is to bore your audience. So the shortest one I've ever done has been 3 minutes. The longest one I've ever done has been close to 30. It just depends on the kind of case you're dealing with. We do these in death penalty cases. Those tend to run longer because you're usually telling a whole life story.
It's a little bit more of an epic story, I would imagine, when you're talking literally life and death.
Yeah, and a lot more people to tell it, a lot more witnesses and things like that. There's no hard and fast rule, but on average, I try to keep it under 15. I just think that's something that judges appreciate. Judges are busy, their calendars are busy. Do they want you to bring in 5 or 10 live witnesses to ramble on at sentencing time that could take an hour in court? Or do they want 15-minute concise video with their statements boiled down to the most important points that they can watch in their chambers or in their living room on their own time? They like that. That's an argument in favor of this for the judges. They call it judicial economy. Saves time.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So my final question to you, maybe my darkest question for you.
Cool. I like dark.
Have you ever used one so effectively that you really got a convicted felon sentence reduced so much that they didn't deserve to have it reduced that much?
No. That's an easy question. No. I think it goes back to the truth element. Like if a video is that compelling, it's because the reasons are there to do the right thing. And if the judge is swayed and they do the right thing, then I'm happy. My clients are happy, and I think it shows that the system actually works. Not everybody deserves to have the hammer dropped on them.
Well, Doug, thank you for being here on Business of Story. Really fascinating
Thanks
subject
for having
me.
me. Yeah.
Where can people go to learn more about you and the work you're doing? And we will put a link to the video, or embed the video of the documentary, the 9-minute piece they did on you in the show notes.
Sure. So my website is dougpassonlaw.com. So just my name. And I also have a separate website that's my blog, which you could get to through the website, but it's just my name, dougpasson.com, and that blog is called Story for Lawyers. So that's just about pure story technique that we use in our legal cases. And there's a little sign up thing. You can give me your email and get on the mailing list. So anytime I publish something or have a speaking engagement or whatever, I'll let you know. Yeah.
And, the other thing I would, for you listeners out there, I get to talk to a lot of story artists, as you know, like Doug, and I review their books, I review their materials, and I was really encouraged by your writing. This is a man that really, really understands story structure, its impact on humanity, on our life. And it's really the first time in Business of Story that we've been able to bring this intersection of story and lawyering here on the show. And I think it's fascinating. So you can learn a lot from Doug's writing on stories in particular.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you having me on, and maybe I'll come back for an encore, and maybe I could beat Robert McKee and do a three-timer or something like that. I don't know. But no, seriously, thank you.
I hope I never require your storytelling services.
I hope you don't either.
And thank you all for listening to this edition of the Business of Story. If I can be of help to you, you know where to find me at businessofstory.com. If you have particularly liked what you've heard today and how Doug has shared his approach to storytelling, as real visual advocacy, and you think there's someone in your life that could benefit from this, colleague, family, friend, member, whatever, feel free to share this episode with them. It's how we spread the good word of story in all aspects of our life. And of course, until next Monday, when we'll have another story artist on like Doug, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thank you for listening.